bringing the people behind our food to life.
I like to define fermentation pretty broadly as the transformative action of microorganisms. But of course, not every transformative action of microorganisms results in something delicious that we wish to put into our mouths. And generally, we reserve this word fermentation to describe desirable or intentional microbial transformations. Biologists definitely work with a more specific restrictive definition of fermentation, which is that it's the production of energy without oxygen, anaerobic metabolism. And most of the fermented foods and beverages, meet the scientists' criteria. But the reason I prefer to work with a broader lay definition is that there are a handful of what I call the oxymoronic ferments that actually require oxygen. Some examples of that would be vinegar, kombucha, tempeh, certain kinds of cheeses. So I just prefer to work with this broader lay definition that incorporates the scientific definition, but also the anomalies and sort of unites them under the idea of microbial transformation. My gateway into fermentation was definitely sauerkraut. And I really recommend that to people who are interested in fermentation and, just want to know where to start, just because, it's incredibly easy, it's intrinsically safe, you don't need any special starter cultures or any special equipment. You can get results relatively quickly. It's very delicious. It's, supportive of good health. So, there's lots of things to recommend it as a beginning project. From there, I think I got into yogurt, some country wine making, playing around a little bit with cheese making. Then I tasted somebody's homemade miso and wanted to figure out how to make miso. So, I got the book of miso and learned how to make miso. I learned how to make tempeh. And then, by that time I was thoroughly obsessed with all things fermented and, really began seeking out, information to try to learn how to make other kinds of things. But I would say that I have experimented at least a little bit in, pretty much every realm of fermentation. Really my first experience, teaching people how to make sauerkraut was, my first encounter with the pervasive fear of bacteria that people project onto, such a simple and safe process. So I got very interested in the idea of, like demystifying it for people and, helping people who were afraid overcome that fear and, learn the simple techniques for doing it. And, it was really, teaching that led me into writing. And the first time I started writing about fermentation, I just realized I wanted to have a broader context. So I started reading, I read a biography of Louis Pasteur, and, that also sort of addressed, the whole emergence of the field of microbiology. I have a liberal arts education. I majored in history. I'm just very interested in, how things come to be. And then while I was working on my latest book, The Art of Fermentation, I really immersed myself in microbiology. And I really never, I haven't taken a biology class since ninth grade, but I just find all the microbiology stuff so fascinating. And, bacteria, bacteria are these shapeshifters, and the emerging consensus in evolutionary biology is definitely that all life is evolved from bacteria. But once you start learning about some of the details of bacteria, basically microbiologists are rejecting the notion of species for bacteria. Like species is something that is fixed genetically. We are genetically fixed. The plant is genetically fixed. A fungus is genetically fixed, but bacteria have this like incredible genetic flexibility flexibility. And basically, any bacteria given, or, any bacterium, given the availability of the right genetic material and the sort of, the reason to change, a different environment, a different nutrient to metabolize, can really become any other kind of bacteria. And microbiologists are likening, the role of genes in the life of a bacteria to the way human beings use tools. You don't have to carry a knife or an axe or a jackhammer with you all the time. You pick up those tools when you have some, specific reason why you need to use them, and then you don't have to be encumbered by them all the time. You put them down when they're no longer relevant. And so, basically bacteria can do the same thing with genetics. And so I don't know, I've just become fascinated by that, and that's really all through book learning, and also talking to people, visiting microbiology labs. I would hope that we are in the midst of a real paradigm shift. For all of us who grew up in the United States, during the second half of the 20th century, it was just all about killing bacteria, fearing bacteria, avoiding bacteria. Scientists in the academy are developing a sort of greater appreciation for the importance of bacteria in our, physiology and functioning. And, if we were to sort of succeed with that sort of, 20th century agenda of eradicating bacteria, they would be committing suicide. So I think that there's a growing appreciation of the importance of bacteria. Hopefully we'll sort of be seeing, young people, without the indoctrination that bacteria are so, terrifying. I think of fermented foods as being pre-digested. So the fermenting organisms are actually, digesting the nutrients of the food, into some other form. The biopreservatives, the acids or the alcohol that enable food to be stable for long periods of time, those are products of the, pre-digestion of carbohydrates, into other forms. Proteins generally get broken down into amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. So, the how is basically, it's like little microorganisms, eating it before us, and breaking it down, before we do, which, makes certain nutrients much more bioavailable to us, generates these other fermentation byproducts like the acids and the alcohol. Breaks down certain compounds that can be toxic in foods and makes them safe to eat. So there's a lot of transformation, and it's a little bit hard to generalize because there's so many different kinds of ferments, kinds of organisms at work. But that's the basic idea, is that these organisms are pre-digesting the food and turning it into something a little bit different. Our bodies are host to elaborate communities of microorganisms that number in the trillions. The current thinking is that the number of cells that we each possess, that we would think of as our body with our own unique individual DNA code, are outnumbered by at least 10 to 1 by bacteria that we're host to. And, I think that really we don't know enough to sort of, say that certain bacteria that are part of the indigenous population of our bodies are good and other ones are bad. But they're the communities that we're, that are indigenous to us and that are part of us. And there's been a lot of really interesting mapping of these communities. I mean, really, the technology's only existed for about 10 years to be able to sort of, really really decipher what these communities are, and different parts of the body have different communities associated with them. And let's say like in your mouth, there's something like 1,000 distinct bacterial strains, in the mouth of a average healthy person, they've looked at different regions. So imagine this area on your arm is something of a desert, and then your armpit is something of a jungle. And these, sort of distinct ecological niches give rise to different microbial populations. The ones that are the most studied certainly are the bacteria of the intestines, because they play such a critical role not only in digestion and nutrient assimilation, but also in regulating our immune function. And the mechanics of how our gut bacteria inform and regulate our immune function is really only very crudely understood, and I think we're just kind of scratching the surface of it. And in terms of the interaction between the bacteria on our food and the bacteria in our intestines, that's another sort of area that is only very crudely understood. It seems clear that unless you're extremely unhealthy, every ecological niche of your intestine is occupied. Some organism is living there. So, when you eat some sauerkraut or some yogurt, it's not like it's entering this blank slate and it can just sort of, take over, the walls of your intestines. I mean, they're entering this elaborate community, and there's some sort of an interaction. And the general model that seems the likely scenario is that the bacteria that you ingest are actually enriching the genetic environment for the bacteria in your intestines. So basically giving them more tools to work with. So even if the individual bacteria in the food don't have an opportunity to sort of, colonize your gut, they actually are sort of enriching the bacteria that are there by giving them a broader range of genetics to work with, to incorporate. I would say that my, outlook on the world is, informed by, political understandings of things. And, my whole, sort of interest in moving, to a rural environment and getting involved in keeping a garden, had to do with a desire to be, closer to the source of the food that I was eating. And it wasn't entirely politicized. I mean, it was also based on sort of, health and a desire, to sort of, be healthy and eat really good food and drink good spring water and things like that. But I do see that as really the broader context for the work that I've been doing. I see all around me, people who are, craving a stronger connection to the food that they eat, and connection to our food, also embodies, connection to the land, connection to other kinds of organisms, being more connected to, other forms of life that nourish us. And, so I see, fermentation as really like a critical piece of that puzzle, how people can, reclaim their food, reclaim, power and connection. And there's sort of economic repercussions of that. There's political repercussions of that, social and cultural repercussions of that. So, I think that, food is very central in our, daily lives. And so, how food gets to our table has, just like enormous, and deep, repercussions. And so, I think food is more than just food, because it, sort of embodies all these other things. I mean, I don't really assume that, fermentation, leads everybody to the same political outlook, as I have. I mean, certainly some of the largest multinational corporations in the world are, sort of fermentation businesses, Kraft, Anheuser-Busch, certainly, fermentation can be sort of, centralized and mass produced like any other aspect of food production. But I think that, after decades of people largely cheering on that process and happy to have centralized food that they don't have to, trouble themselves with producing, I mean, I think that there's been a large sort of backlash against that, and people sort of recognizing that a lot has been lost with that and wanting to sort of take their food back. And so I see the sort of like a revival of interest in home fermentation as, really a manifestation of that.